So good evening. Again, welcome everyone. We are so delighted to have you join us for this Zoom webinar called Religion for Racial Justice. This event is sponsored by the Consultation of Religious Communities, or CRC, which is a network of religious organizations that sponsors events and service activities while working to foster appreciation and understanding on matters of religious and cultural diversity. My name is David Borger-Gurman. I am the current Vice President of the CRC, and I'm also the Executive Pastor at Sanctuary Community Church in Coralville. Tonight's event features 5 different speakers from 5 religious traditions. And our evening will be broken up into 3 different segments. In the first segment, each of our 5 panelists will present and have initial presentation from their own religious tradition. In the second, the panelists will interact with one another over the material that they presented. And finally, in the third segment, we'll address questions from the audience. So you can use your Zoom interface. You can hit the Q&A button and submit a question at any point during the evening if you would like. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible, but it's likely we will not have time for all of them. And thanks to many of you who submitted questions in advance. So I'll be working with those as well. And it looks like we now have just about 100 participants in this webinar. So delighted to have this conversation happening, this crucial topic. All right, with that, let me introduce all 5 panelists and then we'll transition right to their introductory material. So first we have Shams Ghoneim, who is Muslim American, was born and raised in Cairo, Egypt, immigrated to the United States in 1967 and has lived in the Iowa City area since then. She serves on the Board of Trustees of the Al-Aman Center of Iowa in Iowa City and is a longtime member of the Muslim Public Affairs Council and the CRC. Second, Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz, who serves as the Rabbi of Agudas Achim congregation. Originally from Amsterdam, Rabbi Esther and her family moved to the United States. Is it 3 years? 4 years? 3 years. Okay. 3, yay. Okay. Third, Reverend Kimberly Abram-Bryant has been the pastor of Bethel AME Church in Iowa City for 5 years. She is a wife of military veteran who served 22 years in the U.S. Army, and we are glad to honor him today on this Veterans Day. She's also the mother of 3 adult sons and a full-time school counselor. Fourth, Ellen Marie Lauricella is one of 4 lay leaders and founders of the Milarepa Buddhist Center in Iowa City. And finally, fifth, Christopher Epting, who is the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa from 1988 until 2001. And from then until his retirement, he was the Episcopal Church's deputy for ecumenical and interreligious relations. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're delighted to be together. With that, we'll turn to our first presenter, Shams Ghoneim.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum from Iowa City and Coralville area. Our nation and cities have been agonizing over many issues, from violent deaths of African Americans, the terrific impact of COVID on the communities of color, as well as our racial relations and social justice issues. There has been a reawakening since the murder of George Floyd about how to come together as a nation and communities, locally and nationally, to strategically and effectively address racial and social injustice. The Black Lives Matter movement awakened and reminded us all of what is the need for change, and faith communities have a crucial role in addressing this human issue and empowering all of us to come together across real or perceived differences. Early immigrants from all over the world seeking opportunities, hope, justice, and inclusion and equality put this wonderful country together. The American experience is the global experience. We are diverse, racially, ethnically, religiously, politically, with different abilities and identities. Our personal stories may differ, but they all are the story of America. Islam is not new to America. Historians believe that the earliest Muslims came from the Senegambia region of Africa in the early 14th century. The first real wave of Muslims in the United States were African slaves, of whom 10 to 15% were said to be Muslims. Justice, equality, diversity of creation, and human rights are a consistent theme in the Noble Quran and Islamic principles. God says, "O who you believed, stand firm for justice and equity. Never let hatred of anyone lead you into the sin of deviating from justice. Be just. This is closest to being God conscious." The diversity is also within the Quran as a reminder of that God Almighty created us all different. And it says in the Quran, "And if your Lord had pleased, he would have certainly have made people a single nation, and they shall continue to differ. And among his wonders is the creation of heavens and the earth and the diversity of your tongues and colors. For in this, behold, there are messages indeed for all who are possessed of innate knowledge. O human beings, behold, we have created you all out of male and female and have made you into nations and tribes so that you might come to know and cherish one another." The universal human rights in Islam preceded the declaration of the current universal human right 14 centuries ago that included rights to life, freedom, equality, prohibition of torture, right of inclusion, freedom of speech and of movement, rights of women, right of workers, and so on and so forth. The American Muslim community and locally are diverse. We are African American, Southeast Asian, Somalis, Arabs from Kosovo, from Bosnia, West African, and Hispanics, and more. The largest local Muslim community is the Sudanese community. Unfortunately, our communities have been targets of racism, discrimination, and bias, especially since 2001. Our children were called terrorists, Osamas, Husseins, N-word, and our faith labeled as a cult. We are the Abrahamic religions. We are sisters of Christians and Jews. Throughout it all, our faith communities have been and continue to be the heart and soul of our support, our unity, and collective action against the ongoing basic human rights violation inherent in racism and bigotry. Faith communities opened their churches, synagogues, and hearts to the Muslim community. They continue to support us and welcome us. Through interfaith dialogue, we have been truly blessed and empowered. I believe that this is the time and opportunity to come together, get educated on our commonalities, address misconceptions about each other, work together for justice for all and for peaceful coexistence. The pathway to healing must be accompanied by the acknowledgement of the wounds and injuries stemming from our painful history of slavery, injustice, and ongoing racism and bias. The 13th century Sufi Muslim poet Rumi wrote, "Every moment a voice out of this world calls on our soul to wake up and rise. Why struggle to open a door between us when the whole wall is an illusion?" And end with a verse from the Quran. "O you who have attained to faith, be patient in adversity and vie in patience with one another, and be ever ready to do what is right and remain conscious of God, so that you might attain to a happy state." Thank you.
Thank you, Shams. I appreciate your remarks very much. Thank you. All right, we'll turn now to Rabbi Esther.
Good evening, everyone. An honor to be here. I would like to look at this question from two perspectives: our external perspective and our internal perspective, because I think they're both really important to discuss and to discuss them frankly. The external perspective is how we Jews experience racial injustice and how our sources speak to that. The internal perspective is how we Jews within our own community struggle with issues of racial injustice and racism. So Jews are an interesting category when you look at the kind of cosmology of bigotry targeted at human beings. Anti-Semitism is the original conspiracy theory that both kicks up and kicks down. And that makes it a little harder for people to understand than other forms of prejudice or bigotry. What that means is that throughout American history, the status of Jews has been evolving. When the first waves of immigration, of large scale immigration of Jewish people came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, Jews were considered ethnics the way the Irish and the Italians were, and they suffered real limitations, quotas, being barred from universities or country clubs or certain neighborhoods, and had to overcome a lot of overt and covert prejudice and anti-Semitism. As Jews gained access to citizenship and to education, there was a curious process of the so-called whitening of the American Jewish community, where Jews would start to perceive themselves and be perceived by others as mainly being white, but being white in a way that feels more precarious than other white groups because of the factor of anti-Semitism. So the message that a lot of Jews internalized is, we are white, but we're still the victims of neo-Nazi violence, of far-right violence, of prejudice, of bigotry. As Jews have continued to build their lives in this country and continued to be integrated into the fabric of this society, that has been an ongoing conversation. 2018 was a real turning point. In terms of the Pittsburgh shooting, the Pittsburgh massacre in the Tree of Life synagogue, Jews had not seen that level of anti-Semitic violence in decades. And the Anti-Defamation League came out with a report pointing towards the fact that, you know, these are the data for 2019, 2020 hasn't ended yet. Soon may it end, please God. But for the data of 2019, there's been an unprecedented increase in anti-Semitic incidents, a 56% increase in assaults, including 5 deaths due to anti-Semitism. So the context is changing very rapidly. And as American society is continuing to be polarized, it makes Jews feel more and more precarious about how we might be the victims of racist and anti-Semitic violence. At the same time, we are internally diverse. Just like Shams has illustrated that for the Muslim community, Jews are internally diverse, and about 10 to 20% of Jews in the United States identify as people of color, are Jews of color. It is clear, absolutely clear, that the tradition that gave humanity the Hebrew Bible with Genesis chapter 127, that all human beings are created in the image of God, that racism or any kind of essentialist bigotry or prejudice has no place in our tradition, theologically, sociologically, ethically, morally, or otherwise. Our rabbis have always latched onto those texts and said that God is the one who mints coins that are all identical, but human beings, that they are all unique and reflective of the divine image. And it is clear as daylight that Judaism does not condone any kind of racial bigotry. Having said that, that 10 to 20% of Jews of color, almost 1 million people in the United States, do sometimes struggle in the Jewish community, where there are assumptions of whiteness, where there is implicit bias, where they often feel alienated and questioned and othered in their own community, in my community. And that is something that we need to face honestly as well. And there have been huge conversations happening at a communal level, within personal people's lives, within congregations, and more on the meta level about how we can fight those biases and move our own communities forward on racial justice. I guess what I would end with in my last minute, yes, I've got a timer. That's the only way you'll get a Jew to shut up, is by saying that we need to understand how these interlocking bigotries work and how they seek to disempower all of us. And that Judaism's ability to hold conflict, to hold disagreement, to analyze, to look carefully, to engage in self-judgment about what we get wrong or what we get right are some of the tools that our community can offer to the human family, and that we stand in absolute solidarity, and that Jews historically in this country have always stood in solidarity with marginalized communities and people of color. And that's it.
Bravo. Well
you.
done. Right on time. Thank you, Esther. Yes, well done. Thank you so much. All right, without further ado, the next, Reverend Kimberly Abram-Bryant.
Good evening. I'm so glad to be here with such a distinguished panelist this evening. So thank you, David, for inviting me. But the fact that you all are here, your presence is testimony that we have a growing faith community that seeks justice and peace and unity. And it is my prayer that we will continue to grow this community by engaging in conversations and doing the hard work, the work that causes us to be on our knees day and night, and to maybe have some of those difficult conversations that we have tried to stay away from because we are afraid of that confrontation, but knowing that our God stands in front of us, beside us, and all around us. So I will start by a story because I have never had a chance in my life to not know racism or to be separated from it. So I recall very young age, I believe I was 6th grade, my mother took me to, my brother and I, to a film called Mississippi Burning. And I really wanted this to be a movie. I wanted it to be something that was entertaining and maybe just perhaps a little bit educational, that perhaps maybe in my new home of Iowa, I was very new here. I don't have family here. And so my father and my mother moved us here because my father was at the time an AME minister. Believe me, I never chose to be an AME minister. God chose that for me, and I said yes. So, and so in that movie, there were some very graphic scenes, and my family are Southerners. And so I knew, by being raised partially in the South, I knew where to go, where not to go, whom to speak to, whom not to speak to, and how to speak to different populations of people. And so it was just a part of my living. I knew that it was something different about me that would require adults to give me those lessons, but it didn't bother me because I was also a child. I was able to do the things that children do, but it was the moving to Iowa that taught me something different. So in this movie, there was a scene where there were men who were lynched, and my mother exited the theater into the bathroom. She was gone for several minutes, and I was my mother's shadow. So she could not be gone for long without me checking up on her. So I went into the restroom and found her in tears. And I said to her, "Mother, why are you crying?" And it's just a movie. It was at that point where she put me up on the counter of the restroom, where in between the two sinks, and she said, "This is not a movie. I have lived this experience. This is real. It is not a movie." It was in that same year that I was followed home by a young girl in my class who called me the N-word for 3 days straight. And it stirred up some anger in me that I responded in a way that I did not understand was not acceptable. And I was hurt when my parents told me it was not acceptable. It was at that time in those years that I've learned more about my history as being an African-American here in Iowa, but also an African-American within our country, and what that means. And what that means for a Christian who believes in Christ and reads the Bible. And the same Bible that I was reading and the same church print, the same foundation that I understood, that I got my identity, that I was fearfully and wonderfully made, that I was made in the image of Christ, that I'm a royal priesthood, that I am a daughter of the Most High King, those same scriptures were being used to uplift someone, to give them power, and to give them power to not only have the resources, but power to oppress. That is the contradiction that many believers in Christ still have to work out, still have to understand, that the word of God is a word of liberation and freedom. It is not a word to make you more powerful and to give you authority over someone else because of their skin color, where they live. But if you read the word carefully, you will see how Christ called us to care for the widow, to care for the fatherless, to care for the sick. So we cannot separate ourselves from the work of Christ. In the AME Church, social justice work, racial issues are not new. As a matter of fact, in Methodism, I would say our early founder, Richard Allen, he was a member of the Methodist Church. He believed in all of Methodism, believed in the Trinity, that Jesus Christ died on the cross and was rose 3 days after he died, and he was buried in the tomb. So he didn't have any issues with that. That's not why he left the Methodist Church. He left because of the social and racial issues the Methodist Church did not want to address. So when we look at the climate of our country right now, when we look at our fundamental principles and what we believe, what is it that we're having our differences over? Our social and racial issues. That we are still using the word of God in a way to weaponize other people, to hold other people down. So now that this word, and we know that this is a word of freedom and liberation, we know that this word could be used to bring a multicultural community together, to bring peace, and also to bring democratic justice to all. I think the challenge of the Christian church is to do that, to really confront their teachings and to look how we can teach the word of God and all be free and unified in his name.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kimberly Abram-Bryant. Appreciate that very much. All right, we're going to keep moving on, folks. Next up is Ellen Marie Lauricella. Ellen Marie, take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, David, and the Consultation of Religious Communities for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. At our Dharma Center, we practice in the Drikung Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, and our spiritual director is His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche, who is from Tibet and now lives in Arizona. My wife, Naomi, and I became students of Rinpoche 23 years ago, and we have founded 2 Dharma centers under his direction. The first is in Dayton, Ohio, and the second is here. The last 8 months have been some of the most challenging we can remember for our country and the world. In this pandemic, we see before us vividly the impermanence of conditions. We see suffering due to the coronavirus that we have not witnessed in our lifetimes. At the same time, it is systemic racism rather than the coronavirus, which is centuries old and has a virulent history in this country, and which will undoubtedly be with us long after we find a vaccine for the virus. And it is racism which we must actively address as spiritual communities. Like many of you, I am deeply concerned about the hatred, bigotry, harassment, and systemic bias which has prevailed in every aspect of our country for far too long. In preparing for this evening, I reflected on the teachings of my own lineage, but I've also been looking into the ideas of prominent Black Buddhist practitioners, such as Ruth King, who is a teacher in the Insight meditation tradition, and Valerie Brown, who is a student of Thich Nhat Hanh. I have also recently read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, and I found many of his ideas extremely helpful in pinpointing the history and social structure of racism. The work of Black Buddhist leaders, as well as lay writers like Kendi, can provide Buddhists with the tools necessary to begin the work of dismantling racism, both at an organizational level and a personal level. These are the 2 levels at which racism must be addressed. The first level is that of Buddhist organizations. Our Sanghas, or Buddhist communities, must create policies and make decisions which are proactively anti-racist and which are rigorously mindful of inclusivity. Buddhists form a relatively small segment of the faith organizations in this country, and our communities are relatively new. While Buddhist Sanghas formed by Vietnamese and Chinese immigrants have been around for about 100 years, those formed by converts such as myself have been created much more recently, in only the past 60 years. At this point in time, Zen Buddhist centers are often led by Westerners, while Tibetan centers like the Milarepa Center are led by Tibetan lamas or teachers with mostly Western students. When Tibetan lamas came to this country about 60 years ago, they gravitated to the East Coast, the West Coast, and Colorado. One by one, they attracted students and promoted the Dharma. Most of the students who were attracted to these lamas and the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism have been white. The Black and Latinx students who do become members of Buddhist Sanghas often find themselves as the only person of color in the Sangha other than the Lama. For many Western lay leaders, there can be a complacency about this situation. But I know from over 20 years of Dharma leadership in the Midwest that Buddhism is interesting for people from all sorts of backgrounds and races. When developing teaching programs and membership policies, those programs and policies should work towards inclusivity. On the organizational level, we must maintain a goal of creating an equality of access to the teachings, while at the same time abandoning any expectation that any individual or group of individuals necessarily should show interest in the Buddhist path. In terms of concrete ways that we can lower barriers to participation and create a culture of inclusivity, we have to challenge ourselves with questions such as, who is represented on our board of directors and why were those individuals chosen? Where is our Dharma center located? And is it in a location where everyone will feel comfortable? What speakers and guests are we inviting to our centers? And could we introduce programming that addresses racism in a more direct way? Within the Buddhist communities in the West, we must also be mindful about racism and bias that can develop on the part of convert communities towards immigrant Sanghas. There are many Buddhist Sanghas in this country that were founded by Chinese, Vietnamese, Laotian immigrants, and others. These communities are often older than the convert-based ones, and often the Sanghas have very little to do with one another. But with conscious effort, it is possible to have harmonious and loving relationships between all types of Buddhist communities. Here in Iowa, we have a working relationship with the Pure Land of Iowa Sangha in Des Moines, which was founded by Chinese Americans. That friendship has been possible because both of our communities had the intention of creating those bonds despite cultural differences. So these are just a few of the ways that racism can be addressed at an organizational level within Western Buddhist Sanghas. Now I want to turn to how we can begin to address racism within Buddhism on a more personal level. As Buddhists, we understand that it is our self-clinging that leads to suffering. When we put ourselves and our own self-interest at the center of our world, our country, or our neighborhood, we create suffering not only for our others, but for ourselves as well. But when we make love and compassion as the focus of our lives, we are able to create happiness not only for ourselves, but for the people around us. Although everyone has the capacity for profound compassion, it is not easy to develop altruism and love. In Buddhism, we have many, many methods to examine and train the mind and heart in compassion. However, it is said that the tendency towards ego clinging is like a curly dog's tail. You may try to pull it straight, but it will bounce right back again. But with consistent training of the mind and heart, we can slowly transform ourselves. In the same way, I would say that in order to make a change in the racist mindset of white Americans like myself, we must engage in mind training. We must understand that through a lifetime of living in a racist society, we have developed habits of feeling and thinking which are racist. So how can Buddhist communities then support the work of individuals in making the transition from racism to anti-racism? In our tradition, we have some tools to develop insight and mindfulness that can be used to turn our gaze inward and really investigate the racism we carry and express. The Buddhist canon does not specifically address racism, but it does address bias, and the Mahayana tradition is focused on the development of compassion. In Buddhism, literally thousands of meditation methods have been developed in order to assist the investigation and dissolution of bias and discrimination of all sorts, even those that reside at very subtle levels of awareness. In this society at this time, Buddhism has tools to confront racist bias and ego-centered classifications of individuals based on skin color, or culture. We have the tools to dismantle racist assumptions and habits of mind, but those tools must be utilized. Contemplation and meditation are not simply a walk in the park. Meditation and mindfulness in a Buddhist context is never really about stress reduction. These tools are about dismantling the ego and self-clinging, which allows us to believe that somehow we are distant, distinct, superior, or deserving of better treatment than other human beings. As a Buddhist practitioner, I am committed to using the tools offered by my tradition to turn my gaze towards the racist parts of myself that I might prefer not to see.
Ellen Marie, thank you so much. All right, we'll turn to our last presenter, Reverend Christopher Epting.
Thank you, David, and thank all of you for being here. It's an honor to be with you. Let me begin with a little of my personal journey. I was born in Jim Crow, South Carolina in 1946, but I spent most of my growing up years in Florida. My feet were in many ways set on the path toward ordination in the Episcopal Church by the witness of an African-American priest named Nelson Pender. He spoke to our youth group in a church basement in the 1960s about his work in the civil rights movement from the streets of Chicago to the very different streets of Orlando, Florida. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, and as a priest in Florida and later as bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa, I tried to witness and work for racial justice. I once participated here in Iowa in a statewide caravan across the state in the wake of some cross burnings in eastern Iowa. The State Council of Churches in those days was called the Interchurch Forum, and we had an arm called the Agency for Peace and Justice, which worked on most of the advocacy issues. We created a social statement called "We Cannot Remain Silent," and we drove across the state of Iowa in vans, distributing this little booklet, speaking in high schools and Rotary clubs by day and holding a service of witness each night in the local community. Nonetheless, I was aware always of my mostly white church's failings as we sought to engage the civil rights movement and the ordination of women and the place of gay and lesbian Christians in the life of the church. Because there were always a number of us fighting on what I believe has turned out to be the right side of history with respect to these issues, I think I had been lulled into believing that we really had made significant progress, especially when we paid in the 1980s attention to what we called the sin of racism. We opened the ordination process to women and embraced marriage equality, not without decades of struggle and conflict which tore our church apart. But in this last decade, stretching from the murders of Trayvon Martin to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, to Walter Wallace, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the season of racial reckoning our country is facing today, many of us in my church are questioning just how far we really have come, how much we've been deluding ourselves, and the depth of our historic complicity in slavery and racism, which is far deeper and far more insidious than even Christians of goodwill have imagined. Let me quote a few paragraphs from a covenant for reckoning with white supremacy as a House of Bishops and the Church. It's a new document, relatively new, And as the title suggests, it's a covenant that was made initially between ourselves as bishops, but intended as guidance for the whole church, the Episcopal Church. We began racism as a sin. At its core is white supremacy, the ideological assertion that whiteness and white superiority in virtually all facets of society. As bishops of the Episcopal Church, we strive to follow Jesus on the way of love, a way that is diametrically opposed to white supremacy. We join all the baptized and the voices of many faiths and cultures around the world in denouncing racism, and we acknowledge that denunciation can be mere words. Accordingly, we commit ourselves to the sustained and arduous work of dismantling white supremacy with the power of love. We begin that work among ourselves as bishops. We confess and lament that we, as individuals and as a body, have accommodated and been complicit with racism in the wider culture, in our dioceses, and even with one another. We repent of this failure of love. Following Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit, we commit ourselves to amendment of life. To that end, we now commit ourselves to meditate on the life and teachings of Jesus, who restores us to right relationships with God and one another and ourselves. We commit ourselves to tell the truth as Native, Black, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and mixed race people, and as white people, to tell the truth and honestly reckon with our church's historic participation in colonialism, white supremacy, and racial oppression. We commit ourselves to respond directly to those truths by listening, speaking, and acting and leading in ways that bring healing, reparation, and justice. We commit to seek and trust the discernment and the stories and the wisdom of communities of color and other underrepresented groups in our House of Bishops, in our diocese, and in the wider society. We commit to make room for leadership practices that reflect many cultures and races and languages, genders, and other expressions of the diversity with which God has gifted and equipped the church. We commit to guard one another's dignity, and whenever we witness anyone being demeaned or oppressed, to intervene in love, to stop the painful behaviors and bind up the wounds, to create ongoing safe channels for dialogue and accountability between those who are the targets of oppression and those who are protected and advantaged by oppressive systems. And finally, to ask at any of our gatherings, who is not at the table? Whose story and language needs to be heard? And how will they now be sought out and embraced? Well, there's more, but that gives you the idea of this covenant. We're trying haltingly to follow the ancient moral and ethical pattern of contrition and confession and amendment of life, including, where possible, making restitution to those we have wronged. I do have to say that I think efforts like this have prompted a number of our dioceses and seminaries and even parishes to do a pretty deep dive into their histories and to own up in many ways that we as institutions have benefited and even been built over the years on the backs of enslaved people or their descendants, still living under oppressive systems, including the church, which are heirs to our shameful history as a nation and people. Some of those institutions have taken steps toward reparation. The Diocese of Texas has committed $13 million in reparations to the descendants of once enslaved people. The much smaller Diocese of Maryland and a number of others have committed $1 million each to similar efforts. My own Diocese of Iowa this month passed a similar resolution committing us to a season of truth and healing, during which we will take tangible and enduring actions toward the healing of the sins of slavery, indigenous genocide, and displacement, and racism through earnest and sacrificial actions, including a reparations task force which in consultation with the beloved Community Advisory Council, which is based here at Old Brick in Iowa City, to begin a multi-year effort to examine how the diocesan community might take some leadership in repairing the effects of generations of racism in our own communities. So the reparation dollars are important. I think they are important, even if woefully inadequate and always will be. But perhaps the most significant results of our efforts have been to take an honest look at our history, our very specific history in local communities, states, dioceses, and institutions, at just how complicit we have been, and how our very existence as a church has often been dependent on the work of Black and brown people we never acknowledged or valued appropriately. So it's a beginning, but only a very small and a very late beginning. From here, we have a long, long, long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to take a moment to appreciate the naming of white supremacy specifically tonight. I think it's very, very important that we just be very clear about the role that white supremacy has played, continues to play, and that an event like this, I just want us to acknowledge that that is exactly what we are trying to fight. And as much as we are trying to fight the negative of that, we're also trying to produce a positive front of liberation and justice that would go directly against that. So thank you for that. Okay, we're now entering the second segment, and I want to invite the panelists just to respond to one another's presentations. I know it was very diverse, and that was purposeful. I in the construction of this event, just invited you all to speak from the heart, from what you would want. And so there's a lot going on, a lot of threads we could pull here, but go ahead. What would you like to pull on and emphasize from one another's presentations?
Actually, for me, I was, I'm so deeply moved by everything I heard, just beyond the words. But something that Rabbi Esther mentioned that really is also hitting home. Within the Muslim community and its diversity, just like our diversity of our nation, there's also issues of tension, whether you are in different sects like Sunni or Shia, or you are a person of color, or you are an Arab, or you are a European or a Latina. And this is really something that has not been necessarily went into in details, but it's really important to also address, because it's not only between minority communities in the country that there are tensions and difficult conversations that must have, but within our minority faith. So I really appreciate what Rabbi Esther mentioned, because this is something that our community, I know locally and actually nationally now, are also trying to navigate. It's a human frailty, I think. It's the human condition. Why is it that some people think that they are better than another? Who is the other? That other idea. And why are we doing this? And how can we combat it? But thank you.
One of the things that I appreciated about Esther's presentation also was the acknowledgement about Jews' ability to be self-critical, or to, the whole Hebrew Bible in some ways is an exercise in being able to be self-critical. And Christians have not majored in that. And I don't know about other faith communities so much, but we are way behind in being able to, in a sense, like the prophets, step outside of our own faith community and criticize it, critique it in a holy way, in a way of judgment that leads to healing. So we can learn from you there, as in so many other ways.
And Chris,
Thank you.
I am so deeply touched by what you said. I just, it just opened my heart and my mind and my soul, and how grateful it is to hear what you said. It's going to take a long time to kind of digest it all and see how can we all learn from that wonderful sense of healing. How can we take that time in our country and in our nation and the world to really admit our role in being maybe subconsciously complicit, because we all have implicit biases maybe that we're not even aware of. But once you start really facing it, it's very, very empowering, but also unsettling. So thank you.
I think for me, I was recruited by the congregation in 2016 and went into a long and arduous visa process. But when I was recruited when Barack Obama was still the president of the United States. And I had in fact studied in seminary in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, and remember the joy and elation of the nation's first African-American president or Black president. And that had been kind of my background as I kind of wove in and out of the United States, because actually legal immigration is incredibly complex. Even for a Northern European person like me, it's very obtuse. And so I arrived after an 18-month visa wait, because the immigration process is really obtuse and very random in many ways. There was a very different reality in the United States. And I think I went into it with a lot of naivete and a lot of lack of consciousness. And I've been reflecting a great deal on that over my 3 years here. If you would have asked me 4 years ago, are you an anti-racist? I would have said absolutely yes. But I was never really given the tools or the encouragement to reflect on my own whiteness and how my whiteness has changed in different contexts, because whiteness is a social construct to the aid of white supremacy, right? So I've had to journey deep into my own whiteness and my own Jewishness, and how these two things can exist side by side, and how my identity as an immigrant plays into that, and identity as a Jew, as a member of a persecuted minority in some ways, but also as someone who has incredible skin privilege in many other ways. And I guess, I'm really resonating with what Ellen Marie said from the Buddhist tradition, that I've taken this on as what we in Judaism call musar, like a spiritual discipline of applied ethics, spiritual ethics, by digging deeper into myself and knowing that I have a lifetime of learning, and that's okay. That's my path. And I'm just really moved and struck and also saddened and angered on behalf of Reverend Kimberly's account of, watching Mississippi burning, and how close that intergenerational trauma is to your community. And, it's complicated, but I think if we can all lower our defenses, for those of us who come from communities where we need to do that inner work, because it's what God is calling us to do. It is our spiritual path. And it is not only for the redemption of our world, but it is also for the growth of our own soul. That really resonated with me, both from the Buddhist perspective, as well as what Reverend Chris said from the Christian perspective. This process of atonement, what we in Judaism call teshuvah, return or repentance. And of course, the immigrant experience and the complexities of our communities that can be internally diverse as well, that Shams alluded to, but also that Ellen Marie alluded to with the Pure Land Buddhist, Chinese American Buddhist community that she partners with. So I think there are like so many layers here, and the best thing for me, at least, is just to receive them with an open heart and open eyes.
Yeah. And Reverend Kimberly, I have to say something quickly because, you know, my complexion is different than my children and my husband. So the experience of my children, even in Iowa City, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and now when they're adults living in Chicago or in LA, was completely different. And I'm still remembering my son at grade school in Iowa City, some 40 years ago, coming home crying. Why? Somebody called me that N-word. And I said, I was so furious. And I said, he said, what does it mean? So we went into this very detailed, age appropriate, trying to say, first of all, nobody should call anybody any name, but what does it mean? And I remember calling the principal of the school, insisting that the parents of that child be at least aware, if they are not aware, and the impact of that on any child. And then later on, as they were in the workforce, they also faced the same thing, being stopped in Chicago. You know, my son coming from his practice, wanting to make sure by the police saying, well, is this car yours? For no reason. So my experience and my kids' experience, even though we're all coming from, you know, Egyptian background and whatever you want to call that, you know, genealogically, we are mixed actually, was always a very interesting, you know, issue. And my daughter was telling me, you don't understand, you're white. And I thought, what? This language I've never heard of. I didn't grow up with that. So really being labeled by the complexion and how it impacts a young child, a teenager, and an adult is something that I had to understand because I didn't understand. So I just want to show that I know what you're saying, and I thank you.
Thank you. I'm reminded too that, you know, when we look at race was designed out of white supremacy, and it does its job very well, right? To divide, to create harm in to other people and other populations, to isolate us, which makes us more vulnerable, to attack, and to make sure that power dynamic is one-sided, right? So when we look at race and we look at how we're even brought here together, it's the redesigning of a people, of humanity, that we now create a new definition of who we are as a people. I mean, think about the identity of our country right now and how, you know, we look forward to something else because we want to redefine who we are and our own identity. And I think the hard work what Chris had talked about in that atonement and making sure that you all are making those necessary steps, addressing biases and repairing and restoration. That's hard work. Hate is so easy, but repairing and restoring is where the hard work really is. And white supremacy is so entrenched and embedded. If you think about this, like I was going through some of my readings of the AME Church, and one of the lines said that the AME Church, it says the Black Church has been intertwined with how to contend with white supremacy from the very beginning of the church.
Wow.
Chris said it's so long and it's so large that what we're looking at also is building up endurance and perseverance. So how do we do that through the next generations? Because this problem is not going to leave us.
I really appreciate Ellen Marie's holding up the Buddhist witness of contemplation and meditation, deep prayer. All of our traditions have that somewhere within it, but it's been minimalized so much over the centuries for us, and many of us are trying to recapture that sense of going deep within, in quiet and silence and prayer, no words, in order to be renewed to go forth, not as an escape, as you say, or not as a self-help program, which is how meditation is often misunderstood, but as a way to refuel and move into action. So thank you for that, and your tradition for that.
Well, and I wonder, oh, go ahead, Ellen Marie, go ahead.
I guess I wonder, I just have a question for everyone. One of the things that I sort of work with and struggle with and think about a lot is how to integrate activism, sort of activism outside of my Buddhist life, if I even have a life outside of Buddhism, I don't know. How do we intermingle these identities? Because I'm actually also an activist, and I generally don't combine those two communities or worlds entirely. But I wondered what, and that's for specific reasons, somewhat having to do with the way Buddhism has come to this country. But anyway, I just wonder, I'd love to hear you all talk about that a little bit. Like, how do you see sort of real political activism? You know, how do you see that fitting into your lives, your faith lives?
Well, from the Muslim perspective, really, which is a little bit different maybe than the Western way of thinking, Islam is an entire, complete system of navigation. Politics, religion, social justice, it's all in one. So it's incumbent on every Muslim and Muslim government to actually be completely not only active within the political system of government, whether you are in the US or in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East, but you also have to be following the basic principles of human rights in wherever you are. So you're sort of like a messenger of your own. So when I came to this country, really, it's been a blessing. I mean, I came by an accident, completely, by marriage, actually. So it has been a wonderful opportunity for learning, but I got to know my faith more even deeply than if I stayed in Egypt, which is predominantly Muslim. And through the interfaith dialogue, which again, I came into CRC completely by accident before 9/11, has been a bright star in my life and continues to be. Because these kind of, even though I come from a mixed faith family, and still my kids are also mixed faith family, we're all intermarried with Christian, lovely people. And that knowledge early on, I felt that's what the basis of all humans, we're all in together. We look at God differently, we practice differently, but we are all together. So I think political participation for me was just part of being a Muslim or an Abrahamic faith person. So.
Yeah, others?
Well, I think Christians have had to learn, or still learning, to integrate those two things. We certainly had a sense of separation. Even as we talked about separation of church and state, we had a tendency to separate politics from religion, which never should be. We don't need to be partisan, and we shouldn't be, but we can always be political. And I think rediscovering even how political Jesus was in dealing with Rome and has helped us really maybe get over our shyness at engaging the political order from a faith perspective, with our feet firmly planted in our faith.
Jews have a long history of social justice and political activism in this country, and often are really invested in this idea that we marched with a lot of, African-American civil rights leaders during the civil rights era. This very famous image of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma, saying, "My feet are praying." But I actually think that there's also a danger there as well, because we become so wedded and vested to this view that we sometimes see it uncritically and fail to see that we need to move on as well, that we can't just rely on something that happened 50 years ago, but that we need to reinvent this and engage in it politically and personally, that it's a two-way street. The personal, aka the spiritual, the soul work that we need to do is political, and the political is also the soul work that we need to do. So, I think the Jewish community as a whole obviously is diverse, and people are in different places on these issues, but for the most part, there is a lot of goodwill to move forward on these issues. But I also think that we still have a lot of work that we need to do in our own communities and our own selves with regards to white supremacy that has kind of like wrapped its tentacles around our souls sometimes. I'm thinking of what Reverend Kimberly was saying about how easy it is. I think it's seductive. White supremacy is very, very seductive. Hate is very, very seductive. And it has great magnetism. And how do you consciously uncouple yourself from that magnetism, from that pull? But yes, for sure, the major Jewish denominations have stood up in the wake of, George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and taken much more explicit responsibility. As for myself, it's been really interesting because I was undergoing my legal immigration process at a very difficult time for even legal immigrants. And I was very shy about being outwardly activist because of the complicated personal situation that I was in a new country. I have so much to learn about the historical context. My status wasn't resolved. I now am a permanent resident, so y'all are stuck with me now. But I think that actually created some space for me to be inwardly reflective rather than just shoot from the hip, which would be my normal impulse because I have a big mouth. And I actually think that was good for me because I had to redirect that energy inwards and really look at my own implicit bias, my own constructed whiteness and my own racism. And that is also political. How I teach my children is political. How I involve them in these conversations is political. And that is a stepping stone. And who knows to where that will lead. But I think that is also the seed of activism that we plant in our own souls.
Well said, thank you. Kimberly, Reverend Kimberly, I wonder if you have anything to add about political engagement and yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say, for the quest of, the Black church, when we look at our salvation, it's always been alongside our social and political freedom, that we have not been able to disengage from that conversation. Our freedom has to have a political conversation. And so I think what we've seen since this recent election is an uprising of Black voters, but also allies, because of the teaching that is coming in the connection between what is personal, but what is also spiritual and political. And so I think we have to keep that momentum has to remain, because we have to draw the commonalities from what we teach to what we expect from our leaders. and what we expect from our country. And so in order to have to reimagine this new world of doing anti-racist work, we have to find a way to make sure that those things stay intertwined. But like Rabbi Esther said, I mean, we also have to be able to look at it a little bit more critically as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And Ellen Marie, I appreciate you asking that question because it was also a question that we had submitted. So well done. If you're watching, you can submit a question. We have a little bit of time remaining. We'll try to take some. I want to throw out one that was submitted before the event, and just kind of leaning into the practical, pragmatic side of this. But so someone asked, what does it look like to prioritize anti-racism work? I know some of you hit on that a little bit in your first presentations, but maybe we can share some models or things practically or recent stories. What are you doing individually? What are your communities doing?
Well, I think it's one-to-one first. But my community, for example, the majority, as I was trying to say, are actually persons of color. But we still outreach to everybody from within the community, whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims. And I think really, if we reach out to someone that we've never had any relation with before, we build allies, we understand where they're coming from. Maybe because I have this internal familial discussion, if you like, between myself, my kids, and extended families. I think it's very important that we reach out to communities of color, African Americans, and work together to empower each other, actually. We be the voice for the voiceless, if you like. And something that the Iowa City community has done because of the recent tragedy, actually, from the Floyd murder to others, about the Black Lives Matters. Now the city has the TRC coming up. The city has agreed to put the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is in place. So I see this as a bridge. This is from the government level. There's University of Iowa too. We have the Center for Human Rights Center that's also always dealing with issues of human rights and human rights violation and addressing racism. So it has to be on different levels. Personally, get to know someone that doesn't know you. As a Muslim, I had to do that, Never known a Muslim, here I am. And if I am perceived as, a member of the majority by complexion, well, I want to know what's your issues. How can I be an ally to you? But it's just one-on-one, I think. It starts by one-on-one. And then faith-to-faith community.
Thanks. Yeah. What else?
Decades ago, our church nationally had passed a resolution encouraging or even mandating congregations to engage in anti-racism work and training, just to go through the process of asking some of these questions, which most of us had never confronted, many of us had not confronted. And today, all clergy and lay leaders, people who teach Sunday school and all the rest, are expected to have a certain level of anti-racism training, anti-bias training. And it's been a long slog, but I think it's gradually beginning, to make a difference. And we've been through several incarnations of ways to do it. Sometimes it's not very effective. Other times it's been more so. We're refining it to the point where I think we're getting a little closer. Our own beloved community network here in Iowa City has resources for that kind of thing, and indeed is engaged in training across our diocese for that work. So it's a question of the church itself, in addition to the one-on-one, which is so critical. The church itself as a body talking about these issues, hopefully in a safe space.
I think for our community, we're kind of in that stage of education and representation. Obviously, we're a pretty small community, and we do try to lift up our congregants who are Jews of color to leadership positions. Usually that will mean that it's one person because just of the size of the community or like the level of involvement of different congregants at different levels. You know, prior to the pandemic and to, you know, George Floyd killing, we had actually had a lecture series by Professor Darrell Heller, who very unfortunately for us, maybe not for him, because he went to do on great things, left Iowa City and returned to Indiana. But he gave a magnificent lecture series at our congregation on Jewish-Black relations in the United States. You know, and we have started looking at a way in which we can audit our curriculum, our religion school curriculum, with a Black Jewish educational consultant and racial justice activist to kind of help her look at what we can do better. Again, representation, you know, this goes beyond me preaching on the topic, which I certainly have, but to look for ways to really lift up those perspectives and voices in their own right. Of course, the pandemic makes it all a little more complicated, but I think there's a lot of goodwill in our community, but I also think that there's still that challenge of translating that good intent and goodwill to actual action, you know, that goes beyond, you know, implicit bias trainings, which are important, and I find them very enlightening, but to move to that next level. So I think the pandemic is allowing us to incubate some of those ideas, and then to see once, you know, we gather in person again and it becomes a little easier to have these conversations, how we can kick it up to the next level.
Let me, I know we have way more we could say. With just a couple minutes here to close, I just want to hear from each of you, if you're willing to share what from your own tradition inspires you or gives you hope to continue this hard work. And you can keep it brief, please, as we're finishing up here. Who'd like to go? What inspires you or gives you hope from your own tradition? Oh, you're muted, Shams. We had to have one of those moments for sure.
Right. Well, for me personally, you know, the majority of our leadership in the mosque are actually persons of color and West African as well. He's the president of our executive committee. But for me, it's just the basic belief in Islamic teaching, equality. We're all equal under God, you know, and that all what differentiates us is our actions and deeds. You know, Muslims believe the only things we leave in this earth after we leave it is three things: a good deed, an ongoing charity, and a loved one who prays for you. That's it. We come with nothing and leave with nothing. So.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to call on you. Well, Kimberly, Reverend Kimberly.
I think what continues to inspire me and to encourage me to engage in this work is truthfully our motto says it all. It is God our Father, Christ our Redeemer, the Holy Spirit our Comforter, and humankind our family, is that we are all family. And that as long as we treat each other how we want to be treated, and as Sham says, to bring unity together, bring unity and peace to each other, I think that we will begin to see movement. But we also have to start looking at ourselves and realize that our brother and our sister, they are also God-given, God-made, and God-loved.
Ellen Marie.
I'm inspired by the Buddhist idea that we all have Buddha nature. And actually in our tradition, that doesn't just extend to all human beings, that all human beings have Buddha nature, and that all human beings have this potential to reach enlightenment, but that all beings, including all the animals, all sentient beings, have this quality of Buddha nature, and that all beings are the same in wanting happiness and wanting to be happy. And in addition, we have this idea of interdependence, that in fact we are completely and utterly interdependent, and that our very identities are only exist within the context of other people, other animals, the planet itself, that we are utterly each other, one another. And so actually any idea, you know, of racist ideas or bias of any sort is completely preposterous and is just wrong view in the Buddhist world, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Chris.
I guess I would have to say what inspires me are the saints that have gone before me in my own tradition. 2 words, Desmond Tutu.
And Rabbi Esther.
You know, I'm thinking of how we are part of this amazing tradition and this amazing Bible that was written by Black and brown people. No, honey, you need to. Okay, I know the cat is on the table, but that's not important right now. That we have the models in our history and in our tradition and in our wisdom, and we already carry those voices with us, and that the core teaching of Judaism, that you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt, is our formula to generate empathy, radical empathy out of trauma. That trauma does not need to beget more trauma, but that we can break that cycle and let trauma beget empathy. And I'm just reminded of Deuteronomy 10, where, you know, this commandment to love the stranger is repeated time and time and again and again and again in the Torah, but every time it is said throughout the 5 books of Moses, it gets a little better. And in Deuteronomy, right towards the end of the Pentateuch, it is God loves the stranger. That our God, you know, the almighty, wondrous, powerful God listens to the outcry of the most vulnerable. That God is watching. God is on this, and we need to be on this. And it's just so sublime that God is here to hear the call of the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the poor. And so must we. It really is that simple. It's not rocket science. This is it, folks. This is what we're here for.
All right, and with that, we're going to wrap this up. So one of the serious liabilities of Zoom is we cannot hear the audience applause. So, but I do want to say thank you to each of our panelists. Very much appreciate both your personal stories, your willingness to share with us, and but also your reflections on the tradition and the intersection both of the individual and the collective things that we can do. To all participants, thank you so much for attending this evening. You will receive a follow-up email that will contain a link to a 1-page document with suggested next steps. So look for that email on Thursday. I would like to leave with you a quote from James Baldwin. I call him Saint James. His candle is right behind me over there on the table. James Baldwin wrote this in a New York Times essay in 1962. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. To that goal, friends, let us face the truth of every injustice that we might change it. On behalf of the CRC, we wish everyone all the best, stay safe, and good night.